blogosphere versus traditional media, if I understand that correctly.
Okay, I'm going to kind of take up where Max left off, and I am going to talk about patterns in news coverage, and particularly this idea of how climate change is selectively framed across both political discourse, scientific discourse, and the media, but focus more specifically on what this means for public opinion, public perceptions, and also public participation. And in fact, actually, understanding, as I'll argue, understanding research related to framing is in fact actually, I believe strongly, an important tool that science organizations and others can use to actually widen public attention and understanding of an issue like climate change, and widen public participation, not for advocacy purposes, but rather to empower the public to participate in the many collective choices and decisions that are going to go on. And part of the research that I'm going to talk about is in collaboration with Ed Maybach, who's at George Mason University in the Center for Climate Change Communication, which some of you may know Ed or have read some of his work. And this research is funded by a grant that we're working on with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So it seems like an awfully long time ago, it was almost nearly 2 years ago, that in 2007 that Al Gore and the IPCC scientists shared the Nobel Peace Prize for the work on the science and then their work on communicating about the science. And as Max showed in his graphs, also during 2006, 2007, we had sort of historic record amounts of news attention to the issue of climate change. So as of 2007, the science was more certain than in any time in history. And the voice related to that science was louder. There was some interference and there was some distortion in that science, as I'll talk about, but we had record amounts of media attention, all-time record amounts of media attention to the issue, and also quite a lot of spillover into the entertainment media, such as the Academy Awards, across the different sectors of the media sphere, as I'll talk about a little bit. However, as many of you know, have been following and been probably been concerned by the trends related to survey research and public opinion, and Max also showed in part some of this, is that despite record amounts of news attention since in 2007, despite ever more certain science, you still see a lot of perceptual gridlock on the issue of climate change. It's almost as if members of the public are living in two different perceptual realities related to, in part, their political identity. But it goes beyond political identity, as I'll talk about. In fact, if anything, since the release of Inconvenient Truth in 2006 and the IPCC report in 2007, this perceptual divide based on political identity has actually been magnified. And most recently, you've probably seen the Pew surveys and also the ABC News Washington Post surveys that show overall in 2009, even among Democrats, concern and also acceptance of human activities leading to climate change is in a downward trend. And this is likely accounted for by the performance of the economy. And I know there's been a lot of concern over this downward trend, and I would actually argue that it isn't as much as concern as we should. There's a number of complex factors here, and it's not as maybe concerning, and I'll come back to that. But the basic point is that we live in these two kind of perceptual realities relative to the problem of climate change, and perhaps just as importantly, climate change overall. This is from January 2009, and Pew will be updating the survey work, or releasing the survey in the next round of surveys on public priorities coming up in the next month. But when asked to think about global warming as a priority for the Congress and the President, global warming ranked dead last as of January 2009 for Americans among roughly 22 different issues. And even among Democrats, less than the majority of Democrats at the beginning point of this year, and this might have probably declined even further, less than the majority perceived climate change or global warming as a top priority. But importantly, what's interesting is that both the majority of Republicans and Democrats and independents see energy problems as a leading national priority. And I'll come back to that as offering perhaps a way forward in terms of public engagement. So this perceptual divide on climate change really cuts against some traditional assumptions when it comes to science communication. Max also touched on this. This is what scholars in science communication critically refer to as the deficit model, and Gwendolyn will also probably talk about this. But these traditional assumptions is that public opposition, if the public is opposed or does not accept the reality of climate change as a problem, that public opposition is really based on a matter of ignorance. And the antidote to that public opposition is to increase science literacy. Science literacy generally narrowly defined in terms of a technical understanding of the facts of science, or potentially maybe relatively simple understanding of the process of science and how scientific knowledge is created. Another part of the deficit model is sort of an implicit assumption that science alone compels action in policy debates. We saw a lot of this, and I'll come back to this, during the Bush administration, when people argued that climate change and policy action related to climate change is fundamentally a matter of sound science. The science is certain, and therefore we must act. And usually the science is then linked to specific policy proposals, such as participation in the Kyoto Protocol, or more recently, cap and trade. One of the problems, and a number of people have argued this, Daniel Sarowitz and Roger Pelkey Jr. in particular, is that when you oversimplify a policy debate as inherently a matter of the science, you actually create the incentive to distort the science or to hype the science on either side of that equation. And when I talk about framing, I'll show you some examples of how that plays out. And part of the traditional assumptions of science communication is that the best way to engage the public is to focus first on formal science education. And of course, that will always remain important. But once people are done with school, the best way to educate them, to reach them, and to empower them to participate on science-related issues is to focus on the really good popular science outlets that we have, like the Science Times section of the New York Times, or the Science Beat, the local newspaper, or PBS Nova, for example. And we still have sort of icons of this popular science model, such as Carl Sagan. People often say, on an issue like climate change, if we only had more Carl Sagans, a lot of these problems would go away. And then finally, communication is often narrowly defined as a process of transmission, and Gwendolyn will talk more about this, rather than the reality, and the most effective way to communicate is through a process of dialogue and a process of conversation. Of course, there's a number of different problems with the traditional models and approaches to science communication that you're probably familiar with. One is that it doesn't really necessarily take into account the reality of audiences and how individuals make up their minds about complex issues and complex choices related to an issue such as climate change or any other type of political debate. In fact, I've argued, along with others, that there's nothing essentially unique about the debate over climate change from other political debates. And in fact, we know from a lot of research, first in social psychology and then in political communication, that instead of an audience being motivated and having the ability to be fully informed and to weigh all sides on an issue like climate change, instead they rely very readily on information shortcuts and heuristics. Social psychologists refer to individuals as a cognitive miser. Every individual is a cognitive miser, and I'll come back to that. Even scientists are cognitive misers. It's impossible for us to be fully informed about all the different choices and decisions and things we have to draw opinions about in our daily lives or in politics. And in my own work, I've looked across different science issues and applied this research from political communication to understand how these science debates often play out in the media and their influences on public perceptions, arguing, in fact, that actually the same principles that apply to politics apply to an issue like climate change. The second way that the traditional model of science communication doesn't fit well is that it doesn't necessarily really fit well with the reality of our fragmented media system. Marcus Pryor, who's a political scientist, has a really good example that he uses in his book talking about media fragmentation and its effects on audiences. And one is the following: is if you came home from work at 6 o'clock in 1985 and you sat down to watch TV, you really only probably had 4 information choices available to you. All 4 of those choices had some steady diet of public affairs information. These were, at 6 o'clock, the national television news programs. But if you came home today and you had cable and you turned on your television, you might have 300 different channels to choose from. Among those channels to choose from, you have some really high-quality sources of public affairs information or science content, but if you lack the motivation or the ability to pay attention to those content choices, you can completely select yourself out of that audience. And you can pay attention to infotainment, entertainment, the Bravo channel, what have you, or sports or ESPN, or your ideologically preferred source of information such as Fox News or MSNBC on the other side. So to focus communication only around the high-quality sources of science content that we have in the media is a mistake. And this problem of choice is greatly magnified when you consider that audiences increasingly are moving online, as Max shows you in his slide from the Pew data. Increasingly, they're turning to the Internet as the primary source of information. On the Internet, the problem of choice is greatly magnified over cable television. So as an alternative, I've argued in a bunch of different articles that this research in the social sciences can be applied to and should be translated to the problem of science communication on issues like climate change and biotechnology, with certain ethical considerations in mind, which I've most recently published in several chapters that came out this year. And the basic concept of framing and research in framing goes back several decades in the social sciences. And one of the lead conclusions going back is that perception is reference dependent, especially when dealing with ambiguous, complex issues such as climate change. And this is, in fact, actually one of the conclusions from work by social psychologist Daniel Kahneman, where he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on decision-making under uncertainty. And in that research, and they showed subjects an ambiguous stimulus in the beginning of an experiment that looked like this figure here. And when they set the context for perception around this ambiguous stimulus as an A and a C, it was very clear to those subjects, it's very clear to you with that context set, that ambiguous stimulus is a B. But if you change the context for perception for that ambiguous stimulus from letters to numbers, and you put a 12 and a 14 around that ambiguous stimulus, what once looked to you like a B is now very clearly looks like a 13. And you can think about the general public, which might lack the motivation or the ability to follow closely an issue like climate change. Climate change for the general public is the ultimate ambiguous stimulus. They're going to readily seek out and look for context-dependent factors, frames of reference within the media and through their interpersonal conversations to make sense of the complexity of that issue and to make sense of that issue very quickly with not a lot of cognitive effort and to rely on heuristics. That's just the nature that's just human nature. So you can think about a frame as organizing central ideas in an issue. What they do is when you frame an issue, you endow certain dimensions of a complex topic with greater apparent relevance than the same dimensions might appear to have under an alternative frame. Importantly, when you frame an issue, what you do is you communicate why an issue might be a problem, who or what might be responsible, and what should be done. And these interpretive storylines, these selective interpretations of a complex issue like climate change, is often instantly communicated in shorthand by catchphrases, slogans, historical references, cartoons, and images. ClimateGate is an example of a frame device that instantly creates a preferred storyline on the part of conservatives and many climate skeptics, and I'll come back to that. You can't avoid framing as part of the human communication process. It's in fact not actually a choice whether to frame an issue like climate change or not, but rather how you frame that issue and with what goals in mind. I'll come back to that. But when we look across the media and we discuss an issue like climate change with our friends or our coworkers, or we try to convince someone of the science of climate change, framing always plays a role. In fact, actually, we make sense of an issue by using the media to inform ourselves and relying on the frames of reference in the media and then sorting out those frames of reference through our interpersonal conversations. When you watch a show like Bill O'Reilly, many of you may not be frequent viewers of that show, but if you watch Bill O'Reilly, you'll know that when he begins every program with talking points. Those talking points are frame devices that selectively trigger a storyline about a complex policy issue. And in fact, conservatives know that what they're doing is they're creating talking points for like-minded audiences to discuss the nature and complexity of an issue like climate change with their like-minded others. Ann Coulter had a best-selling book called How to Talk to a Liberal If You Must. When you pick up these best-selling books, both on the left and on the right, they're narrowly framing the complexity of an issue and they're providing talking points for their like-minded audience. The same thing goes on with MSNBC. When you watch Olbermann or you watch Rachel Maddow, they're selectively framing an issue and they're providing talking points for the like-minded audience to discuss the complexity of that issue with their like-minded friends. And what's interesting, and as Max referred to, when you log on to the blogosphere represents or even amplifies this ideological difference in the media, this ideological fragmentation. For those of you that read science blogs, you probably have recognized that many science bloggers who might be scientists themselves, they write with a clear ideological preference in terms of liberal positions or liberal viewpoints. Same thing if you log on to one of the more popular websites for environmental information, GRIST, or one of the most popular science blogs overall and on climate change, Climate Progress, which is affiliated with the Center for American Progress. And this is important for scientists to understand, is that even scientists are cognitive misers, that scientists probably don't use their political ideology when they conduct science or interpret science, but when thinking about policy options and when thinking about political debates, almost certainly ideology does play a role in shaping scientists' views of the nature of political controversies and the information that scientists might be getting through the preferred media sources, whether it's someplace on TV, in print, or especially online in the many number of science blogs, that will play on the natural ideological tendency of scientists. And what's interesting is that AAAS, when they released a survey earlier this year, a Pew survey of AAAS members, roughly 55% of scientists, members of AAAS, indicated that they're Democrats compared to 35% of the public, and 52% of members of AAAS indicated that they're liberals compared to 20% of the public. There's no doubt that ideology is often probably magnified by the fragmented nature of the media, and even scientists are susceptible to that tendency. It's just part of human nature. So where can you start when thinking about what frames might apply to an issue like climate change? In my own work and others, they've argued that there's a deductive typology of frames, starting with a now classic analysis in the American Journal of Sociology by William Gampson, looking at the nuclear energy debate, and then followed up by researchers at the London School of Economics and my own work on biotechnology, applying and adapting that typology debates over stem cell research and the food biotechnology debate. And more recently, I've argued that this typology should be adapted and used to understand the debate over climate change. And this is what the typology looks like. These are general kind of latent meanings that appear over and over again in political discourse, media coverage, and people's own conversations about the meaning and the relevance of a debate such as climate change and other science issues. And I'll talk about specific examples related to each one of these interpretations. But as you probably know, historically, science in the United States has been narrowly defined in terms of social progress and economic development. Science is important because it improves our lives or it leads to economic growth. Often when science is opposed, however, it's redefined in terms of uncertainty, what's known or unknown, and there's appeals to, for example, peer review. This is certainly the case on climate change. Or it's redefined in terms of public accountability. This was the case with the Bush administration and now most recently with ClimateGate. And this is in terms of, is this the responsible use or abuse of power? Is this science in the public interest or science in the private or ideological interest? And there's even a journalist-preferred frame which really focuses on not the substance of the issue involved, but really in terms of conflict and strategy, the personalities, their strategy, the tactics. And this is often applied by political reporters and general assignment reporters and political commentators. And this is where you actually see a lot of the false balance that might occur. And the tabloid coverage in the UK would be another example of that, along with cable news. And it's probably also a big part of the content of blogs. So I've argued that you can't avoid framing. It's not a matter of whether to frame an issue or not. Certainly framing can be used for negative purposes. Political strategists and advocates often use framing to spin, distort, and to deceive the public or stakeholders or the public, or to distort the science or engage in hype about the science, or to promote specific policy preferences or political mobilization of a specific group. And I've argued that this is a mistake, obviously, to use framing towards these goals on the part of science organizations and others. In fact, though, however, framing can be used for other purposes that are in line with the goal of science organizations and government agencies. And as I'll talk about, framing can be used to grow the audience for science, to make a complex issue like climate change more personally relevant and more significant so that people start paying closer attention and so that different types of learning can start, to go beyond conflict and polarization and to create a context that can promote dialogue and understanding about shared goals and values, and ultimately to empower and enable wider public participation, not to mobilize people around a particular legislative outcome or policy, but rather to empower people to participate in the discussion about that policy, and where they ultimately might end up in their preferences, well, that's part of the democratic process. So how does framing apply to the climate change debate? Many of you are probably familiar with now what's referred to as the Luntz strategy memo. And this is, Frank Luntz is a GOP pollster who earlier this decade, at the beginning of this decade, did audience-based research, focus groups and surveys to try to figure out what frames of reference might downplay a sense of urgency or public support for policy-related action. And in this memo that he wrote for conservatives and for industry that was uncovered by the Environmental Working Group, he recommended that members of Congress who wanted to downplay urgency and others narrowly define climate change in terms of scientific uncertainty. The scientific debate remains open, and also importantly in terms of its possible devastating economic consequences if any action happens, and in what he referred to as the emotional home run, the inherent international fairness of the issue if countries such as China and India are not playing along. And over the course of the decade, and even today, you see outspoken critics of and opponents of policy action and people who argue that against the consensus views on the science of climate change, such as James Inhofe and George Will, they play very narrowly with along this framing playbook, arguing over and over again that the scientific debate remains open, that the science is uncertain, so therefore we should not take action, and any action that we take will have dire negative consequences for our economy and are inherently unfair because countries like India and China are not playing along. In response, historically, many environmental leaders and groups and some scientists, and in particular Al Gore in his movie Inconvenient Truth, have countered the uncertainty in economic development frame or economic impacts frame of conservatives with their own narrow interpretation of the issue, focusing on the potential for environmental catastrophe. Al Gore transformed the issue of climate change using the frame device climate crisis. This is how he referred to climate change in 2006 and 2007 when his movie came about. In fact, the movie poster and the trailer was inherently a very strong frame device. In this case, the poster itself shows a smokestack in the form of a hurricane, drawing the implicit linkages to events such as Hurricane Katrina. And the trailer itself warned viewers that this will be the scariest movie that you will ever see. And Time magazine around the same time, the media echoed this Pandora's box frame, this catastrophe frame around climate crisis. Time magazine, as an example of a frame device with their cover, warned readers, be worried, be very worried, with an image of the polar bear and the threat to this environmental species, this symbolic species of the polar bear. Al Gore himself in 2006 and 2007 became very much part of the overall coverage and discussion of climate change, appearing on many different magazines and across the media, both the news media and the entertainment media, and he remains very much part of the discussion today. But as you can imagine, as well as Inconvenient Truth discussed some of the technical sides of the science, the overall package and the interpretation inherently is what communications researchers would refer to as a threat appeal. And what we know from research on threat appeals is that if you communicate a threat to an audience and you don't give them specific things they can do about that threat appeal often translates either into a sense of fatalism or people ignore the message altogether or discount it. The second problem with the focus of Inconvenient Truth in terms of focusing on dramatic environmental catastrophes such as the potential for more intense hurricanes, as Andrew Revkin has described, the error bars of uncertainty around those specific impacts are a lot greater than the general phenomena of climate change itself. So given the uncertainty of those impacts, it opens the door to the counterclaim by people like James Inhofe and others that Al Gore was engaging in climate change alarmism, which sends the frame of reference back into an interpretation of uncertainty. And then the final problem inherently is when Al Gore is in front of the message about climate change. Earlier this week he appeared on CNN for about a 20-minute segment where callers and people on Twitter and emails were asking him to explain the technical details of the science of climate change, which he did very well. But unfortunately, the unintended consequences is when Al Gore is the front messenger on climate change, it sends a very strong heuristic about the potential partisan nature of the issues. For anyone that does not have a favorable opinion of Gore, which his favorability rating is less than 50%, or roughly about 50%, for half the public, there's a potentially negative heuristic about the partisan nature of this issue. And over time, what we've seen, and Max also referenced this, is that that the issue of climate change on the part of climate skeptics and conservatives has also been linked to a wider narrative about the liberal media trying to take away our freedoms and trying to scare us or impose their values on Americans, mainstream Americans, as they might reference. And over time, what we see is with increasing focus on some of these more dramatic impacts on climate change, and also perhaps the increasing perception of the partisan nature of the issue, you see that Republicans and independents have grown more concerned that the media are actually exaggerating the nature of the problem over time. And you can see that continue through 2009. This is an increasing problem, that the messenger, even the mainstream messenger of the science, might be increasingly discounted by different audiences. The other way that many environmentalists and many democratic strategists have tried to mobilize wider public concern about climate change is to redefine the issue in terms of public accountability. And Chris Mooney's book, The Republican War on Science, as an investigative reporting project, does a very good job of discussing some of the ways that the Bush administration attempted to distort or block scientific advice in the policymaking process. The title of this book itself, though, inherently became a frame device, a rallying cry for members of the left and for many scientists, that they needed to end the war on science in American politics. In fact, when Hillary Clinton gave a speech on the anniversary of the Sputnik launch in 2007, she promised voters that she would end the war on science in American politics. And when President Obama gave his inaugural speech, he promised to restore science to its rightful place in American politics. Now, while this message inherently probably appeals to many scientists and many members of many Democrats and many environmentalists, it also, again, reinforces the signal that perhaps science is for Democrats and not for Republicans. At least presents an image to the problem to the public that there is. It reinforces the perception that there's a partisan divide, which is already made heuristic for the public. And what's interesting about ClimateGate now, that term itself is a frame device that automatically signals the public accountability interpretation. Conservatives and climate skeptics have used the stolen email case as a way to flip the public accountability frame, no longer applied in news coverage to apply to conservatives and Republicans who want to downplay the urgency of climate change, but now actually applied directly to scientists themselves. So instead of just simply questioning the science, now they're questioning the motivation of scientists. And it's a very effective communication strategy. And they've tied it also to a wider narrative about the problem of a liberal media in the United States, arguing that the mainstream media is not covering the ClimateGate event, though of course they are. So how do we break out of this, what seems to be like a proverbial Groundhog's Day in terms of it's the same frames over and over again that reinforce partisan perceptions on the issue? Well, there's a number of different emerging frames that I argue that offer ways to get beyond this polarization and also communicate a greater sense of relevance and significance on the part of the public. One is the focus on climate change not as in terms of uncertain science or devastating environmental impacts, but really in terms of religious and moral duty. And E.O. Wilson, those of you familiar with his book, The Creation, I think he does this very effectively in that popular science book about the environment, where he writes it as an open letter to a Southern Baptist minister, arguing, saying that I, in fact, am an atheist. We might disagree in terms of where we all came from, but we share a common value, and that is what the Bible metaphorically refers to as creation. And we have a duty to be concerned about these issues. And he uses that as the package, as the introduction, to engage potentially with a religious audience who might not otherwise read a popular science book about the environment. And we see this with work by Richard Cizik, an evangelical minister, and Eric Shivian, who's a physician at Harvard University, where they've been bringing evangelical leaders and evangelical youth together with scientists to discuss the science of climate change, but it's packaged, the frame of reference is around this idea of a moral duty to pay attention to this problem. Al Gore, in his We campaign, in the initial set of commercials that were with the launch of the We campaign in 2007, also used a secular moral message And in these commercials, they reference, for example, how the United States came together to face these existential external threats, such as World War II, or how the United States came together in the civil rights movement. And these were the examples and the historical events and the metaphors that were created in these commercials to try to displace this sense of polarization on the issue. Even Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sat on a couch and talked about their common value and their common interest in finding solutions to this issue. And Time Magazine echoed this message around the same time, like they did in Inconvenient Truth, with how to win the war on global warming, using the Iwo Jima statue and that iconic reference to capture the attention of readers. The second emerging frame that's been really prominent over the last 2 years, and for those of you who read New York Times' Tom Friedman, his columns, you know that he uses this frame over and over again, is to redefine climate change in terms of economic innovation and in terms of the overall energy challenge. Here's just an example from a column this spring as a good example of how Tom Friedman kind of connects the dots for his readers on the complexities of this issue. He was arguing in favor, in this case, of a carbon tax. We need a price on carbon because it will stimulate massive innovation in the next great global industry. ET is the frame device he uses, energy technology. The scientific research and innovation needed for America to dominate ET the way it did IT, the information technology revolution, could be the foundation for a second American industrial revolution. Plus, it would tip the whole planet onto a greener path. So American economic rule is the goal, but mitigating climate change would be the great byproduct. And more recently, Al Gore's We campaign has now been rebranded in terms of Repower America. And if those of you are familiar with his commercials, almost every commercial is defined and framed around this idea of the energy challenge, using sort of non-traditional characters, such as a Southwestern rancher who's talking about wind farms, or an auto industry worker, or a construction worker who's talking about the economic potential and retrofitting buildings in terms of economic growth. And if you've noticed, it's rare now that the administration refers to, or members of Congress refer to, the cap and trade bill. In fact, the House bill on cap and trade was renamed the American Clean Energy and Security Act, drawing references for the American public away from something that's complex and maybe uncertain and closely tied to climate change, such as cap and trade as a trading regime, and focusing instead in terms of America's energy needs and also in terms of national security, in terms of oil independence. And then finally, and something that we're working on in our own research now, is the potential to redefine climate change in terms of public health, which is definitely a very much historically undercommunicated dimension of this issue, even though it resonates directly and is true to the emerging science in terms of the human health impacts of climate change. And what's important when you redefine climate change in terms of human health impacts, what you do is you shift the perception of the issue away in terms of its geography from remote polar regions, and in terms of its impact in terms of animal species or symbolic species such as polar bears, and you start to focus the location for impacts, for example, on urban areas or suburbs. And the face of the impacts shifts from polar bears, for example, to minorities, to vulnerable populations such as young children or the elderly, and you connect climate change to things that the public already suffers from or has familiarity with, such as allergies, asthma, and things like infectious disease or susceptibility to heat waves and extreme heat. And importantly, earlier this year, in a review article that came out at The Lancet, reviewing the science and the research on the public health impacts of climate change, and also suggesting a range of different types of policy options, the lead author on that study, he in references to, in comments to the Associated Press, he understood the power or the potential to redefine climate change as a public health problem, or the idea that the public health implications have been undercommunicated. He said the big message of this report is that climate change is a health issue affecting billions of people, not just an environmental issue about polar bears and deforestation. And the other thing is, when you redefine climate change as a public health issue, you bring in communication partners for scientists and environmentalists. Not only now do you have things, people like religious leaders such as Richard Civic or CEOs of major companies now communicating about the need to take climate change seriously. Now you have physicians, you have nurses, you have public health officials, you have public health professionals joining with environmentalists and scientists to communicate about the significance and the relevance of this issue. And public health overall often transcends partisan boundaries. There's a certain moral authority to public health problems. Imagine if there was a Surgeon General's report about the public health impacts of climate change, like there's been a Surgeon General's report on smoking or Surgeon General's report on television violence in kids. And as they wrote in the report, a concerted communication campaign on the part of health officials can create a solidarity and authority that politicians will find hard to resist. So in our research, we're interested directly in testing what happens when you redefine for the American public climate change as a public health problem. The place that we're starting is a survey analysis that Ed Maybach and Tony Lacerowitz and Connie Rosser-Ranoff released earlier this year, and it's based on data collected in the fall of 2008. This is a very large N-size national survey where they asked respondents a range of questions, several dozen questions about their attitudes, knowledge, beliefs, and behaviors related to climate change. And then based on the answers to those questions, using latent class analysis, which is a statistical technique, they grouped respondents into 6 unique audience groups based on the responses to those questions. And right away, what's interesting about the results, and I encourage you, if you want to read this report, if you haven't seen it already, just Google 6 Americas of global warming, and you can see the full report, which is very detailed. Right away, what it starts to do is it starts to change our social perceptions about where public opinion might stand on this issue. It's very easy, and in fact, the polling on the issue reinforces the perception, and I think maybe overemphasizes the perception that the public is not taking this issue seriously or is not concerned about this issue. And I think through media discourse and through media discussion, we also overemphasize or have a faulty statistical sense of the true size of the climate skeptic community, just how many members of the public might be, quote unquote, in denial about the reality of climate change. And what's interesting about the survey results is that the first 2 audience segments believe in human activities, accept the science of climate change, are concerned about the issue, and say that they're motivated to take action. They're not currently directly participating on the issue, but they say that they're looking for ways to do so. That's more than that's roughly 50% of the public are in the alarmed to the concerned category when it comes to climate change. If you look at the far right or the other end of the scale, only really less than 10% of the public are in the hardcore dismissive category, completely reject the science of climate change and have a very strong, hardened opinion about the issue. I've said to Ed what he should do is he should print up T-shirts and sell these T-shirts at the Smithsonian, because this graph itself kind of resets the frame of reference for many people about where the public might stand in terms of supporting and wanting to become involved in discussions of how collective decision-making on what to do about this issue. So using this as a starting point, this summer, we set up a tent on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and we also went other places like Hagerstown, Maryland, which is an outlet mall, and then we also did phone interviews over the phone in terms of to finish out some of our research. But on the National Mall, we had a tent where as people walked by, we asked them if they were from outside of D.C., at least an hour outside of D.C., and if they said yes and they were willing to participate in a survey on climate change, they then filled out a 15-item questionnaire that would accurately and validly place them into one of the 6 audience segments on climate change. And in fact, if you're interested in this questionnaire, if you go to Facebook, there's a Facebook app that Ed and Tony created that will place you into one of the 6 audience segments. So just look on Facebook for 6 Americas of Climate Change. If they then placed into one of the 6 audience segments that we're still looking for, and we also divide them by gender and age, we then invited them to come around the corner into the Hirshhorn sculpture garden and sit with us for 45 minutes to an hour, where we asked them open-ended questions about their current attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, behaviors, and preferences on climate change. So we got people to talk for 45 minutes to an hour in a very open-ended way on these issues. And then we created transcripts about their interviews, and this is what we're in the process of analyzing right now. At the end of the survey, after they described in a very open-ended way, and in fact actually in their own words, how they frame the significance and the relevance of climate change, and that's something that we're analyzing now. We're looking over the transcripts, applying the typology that I showed you to content analyze and to organize the frames of reference across these audience segments. At the end of the survey, we then reset their frame of reference on this issue by having them read a one-page essay describing the public health threats related to climate change, and then what are possible policy actions and the benefits of those policy actions that might take into account that threat. And after reading the survey, we then asked them to say in an open-ended way, what were your thoughts about the essay? And what we've done, and still we're in the process of analysis and writing up the first paper for submission, but this is preliminary analysis, we then coded the valence of these open-ended segments and looked at the valence of their comments, whether they're positive, whether they're neutral, or they're negative. So if overall the comments were positive, they're coded 1. If they're neutral, they're coded 0. If they're negative, they're coded -1. And then displaying the means across the different segments. So you can see that for the alarmed and the concerned, not surprisingly, they find the essay engaging. Their overall comments were relatively strongly positive towards the essay. What's interesting, though, is that for the doubtful category, which is about 14% of the public, they were not actively and negatively arguing against against the essay when it was reframed for them as a public health problem. The dismissives were. They were strongly opposed. They have strong opinion intensity on this issue, and they immediately start counter-arguing against any information presented on climate change. But the doubtful were relatively neutral in their overall reaction to this issue, to the essay when climate change was framed as a public health problem. Other part of our analysis is then we look at how people reacted specifically to each part of the essay. And when they read the essay, we asked them with a green marker to indicate any phrase or any sentence that they found especially useful or especially clear, and then with a pink marker, any essay or any phrase or any sentence or any phrase that they found especially unclear or confusing. For each sentence then, across audience segment, we then totaled up the difference on each sentence between the green marks and the pink marks. So we have a relative kind of rating system across the essay. What's interesting for the first 3 audience segments who want to take action on this issue, they found most of the essay overall engaging. They found it useful, and they found it clear. But it's around the specific policy actions, what I'll come to in a second, and the benefits of those policy actions, rather than the presentation of the threat, that their positive reactions are strongest. More interesting is that for the middle audience segments and then the very last audience segments, the dismissives, for the doubtfuls and the dismissives, as soon as you introduce the issue of climate change, they start to react negatively. They start to say that the presentation is not clear, it's confusing. But then at the end of the essay, when you talk about specific policy actions that also have co-benefits for public health, they start to react positively to the presentation. And there's one dip there for all the audience segments, and I'll come back to explain what that dip is. So what are the preliminary conclusions that we're working on our analysis? All 6 audience segments in the opening of the essay, when we talked about the relevance of public health, when we presented the frame device, good health is a great blessing, everyone can agree that public health is important. It's a shared value in American society across all audience segments. All six Americas embrace the benefits of taking action. At the end of the essay, when we talked about cleaner energy sources and more efficient use of energy will lead to healthier air for children and adults to breathe. When the essay talked about improving the design of our cities and towns in ways that make it easier to get around on foot, by bike, and on mass transit, reduce the number of cars, and help people become more physically active and lose weight. Or when we talked about taking actions to limit global warming by making our energy sources cleaner and our cars and appliances more efficient, by making our cities and towns friendlier to trains, buses, and bikers and walkers, and by improving the quality and safety of our food, it will improve the health of almost every American. All 6 audience segments reacted strongly and positive to those suggestions, to those proposed policies, and when also presented with the possible co-benefits to things that they care about, their communities and their health. 4 of the 6 Americas found it helpful to learn about the health threats associated with global warming. And this is roughly 65%. This would translate into roughly 65% of the American public. They reacted strongly and positively to global warming can harm people directly and indirectly. Directly, global warming causes more extreme weather patterns, including more frequent heat waves, more violent storms, and rising sea levels. indirectly, global warming harms the quality of water, air, and food in our ecosystems, all of which can lead to increasing rates of disease and death. And then as a result, the poor air quality, connecting the issue to issues such as asthma, allergies, and heart and lung diseases. What's interesting, though, however, is the one thing that all 6 audience segments reacted negatively to was they reacted negatively to the suggestion that we should change our diet and our food choices. So the one sentence, and that was the big dip among the benefits, increasing our consumption of fruits and vegetables and increasing our intake of meat, especially beef, will help people keep a healthy weight, will help prevent heart disease and cancer, and will play an important role in limiting global warming. And those that follow the Drudge Report, you'll know that on the Drudge Report, they almost always single out and highlight any suggestion from, for example, Nicholas Stern in the UK has suggested that the population needs to cut down on meat consumption. Just today on the Drudge Report, they linked to another report from the UK counting. And to lead with this suggestion, perhaps in the beginning of engagement with the public on public health consequences is probably not a good idea. Almost all audiences start to counter-argue against that suggestion. And then finally, what we're following up on in the spring is then we're taking this development of the public health essay and we're going back to the original survey respondents. And we have as a pretest their original attitudes, their concerns, their beliefs, and their actions on climate change. And across several of the segments, what we believe to be the most important segments to either engage or maybe deactivate in terms of their skepticism about the issue, we're introducing the survey either through the public health reference or alternatively we're developing a reference and a frame around national security. And what we're interested in then is how to, in this experimental design embedded in a national survey, what does it mean for a difference or a change in perceptions? And at the end of the survey, we're then asking them to write their own email to either a friend or to a member of Congress about the issue of climate change, not telling them what to write. And then we can capture their text in the direction of what they're arguing and analyze that as well as a real-world dependent variable as an outcome of this study. So thanks. We have a couple minutes for Q&A, and then we'll move on to Gwendolyn.
So quick question on the beef. The slide had said increasing beef consumption.
Sorry,
that was actually
that's a typo,
decreasing.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
But my other thought was that you had done this very careful analysis of the different sentences, and I just wanted to make the point that policy statements, by their very nature, are going to be a lot easier for people to understand than a science statement because just policy is designed to communicate to a large number of people, and the science tends to be, require some degree of training and be a little more obscure.
Sure. That's an excellent point. And I think that's just part of the reality of communicating about the problem of climate change, and it's something that will definitely be in the limitation section, the discussion section of our paper. But I think one of the things that we're looking at is I think the reaction to the policy options. I think it goes to the need to communicate more about solutions and less about the threat of climate change overall. People can understand solutions, and there's often co-benefits, incidental co-benefits to solutions that are proposed that people can value or people can support. And I think one of the problems on climate change is that most of the communication has been around the threat, and not enough communication has been around the solutions. If we are communicating about solutions, it's only one solution, such as cap and trade. There's a whole range of other policy options at the local, national, international level that we're not potentially focusing on in media coverage or in our efforts at engagement.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Sarah Hoffman, and I'm a scientist and a science journalist. And I wanted to bring up some questions about the influence of previous science versus non-science debates, which have also helped with the framing. Some of Luntz's ideas were also incorporated into the creationism debate, the idea of teaching the controversy, the idea of framing the fairness issue. If you're going to discuss one model, you need to discuss the other model with the inherent notion that both models were equivalent. And then a general negativity toward scientific data, in particular with regard to evolution, but there was almost a priming of the public attitudes towards science with the creationism debate. And this ties into a general ignorance of how science is done. And the gatekeeper item that you were talking about earlier is really serious, because newspaper editors frequently cut out how the results were achieved. They report the results as if they come from a black box, or they come from a rabbit or a magician's hat. And another way this is manifested is in the current anti-vaccination debate. You see the same kind of framings, same kind of arguments. And so it seems to me that both with climate change and with these other areas of public health, there's a overall issue of communicating and understanding science that reaches much deeper than just one issue.
Right,
So I wanted to know how you...
I mean, and Gwendolyn will probably touch on this in her presentation as well, but I agree with you that across all those issues, what's in common is the role that framing has played, and how it's then triggered differential perceptions of the issue by either religious identity or political identity. And so part of the solution is to understand and accept the role that framing plays, and understand what you can do in terms of thinking about alternative frames that might not enhance polarization, but might create a context for common understanding or dialogue, or perception that there's of relevance or significance. Quick point on evolution, the National Academies did this by actually doing focus groups and polling to inform the design of their most recent booklet on teaching evolution in schools. And what they found in that research was that one of the ways to communicate the significance and the relevance of teaching evolution in schools, that this actually matters, was to frame evolutionary science in terms of medical progress, and to emphasize the connections between evolutionary science and advances in medicine. For example, we wouldn't know where to begin in battling problems such as bird flu or swine flu if we didn't understand evolutionary science. So that's one quick example, but there's only so much that can do. And I think one of the things that ClimateGate shows is that, you know, one of the reasons I think that people were, that it's grabbed so much attention is that people were surprised by how scientists talk about science in their own interpersonal conversations. They were maybe surprised by the level of uncertainty that scientists work with when they're working with data. And they're also surprised that scientists are human beings, right? They have egos, they have political goals, and in the process of science that there might be some efforts to shape the interpretation of science within the peer review process, but ultimately the peer review process usually wins out. And I think in ClimateGate, in our schools, as you know, we teach a stereotype of how science is done. And I've argued, and I'm interested in actually trying to develop a grant around this idea, is one way to try to start to counter that at the college level for non-major and majors in their introductory science courses is to create a module that can be taught around these questions of the politics and the sociology of science, but also introduce them through the really quality media sources that we have on these topics. So in that case, you're educating the students about science as an institution relative to other institutions, but you're also socializing them and introducing them for, once they leave that class, how can they actively follow science through the media and understand these issues and make sense of them so that they can be active citizens, so that they can participate. And I'd love to talk to other people in the room about ideas on developing a module like that. So we'll take two questions. And then we'll
I'm going to get back to what I was going to say to Max's talk and tie it into what you said. It seems to me that you guys are actually, in terms of this audience, advocating completely different things. Max is advocating we get involved, and you're advocating that there's really no earth science in this problem at all, that it's about public health, that it's about impact, but that earth scientists should just step out of the way because it's really not relevant to what impacts people. So there's some question here as to what it is we're as geoscientists supposed to do with this. But I would also like to point out that I think every scientist believes that the thing we're trying to promote above all is the scientific method, is the scientific way of thinking about things. And for you to say, well, this sells better or that sells better or this will make this point better, is to actually put us back into a role of advocacy, where in fact the only thing we're really hoping to advocate is that people get smart and weigh evidence in ways that are really representative of what humanity collectively understands, and bring the whole society into the scientific process rather than divide us into people who have scientific hats and people who don't.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's definitely not my intention, and the question allows me to kind of clarify some things. The first is that there remains a central role for environmental scientists. One of the points that I was trying to make about the significance of framing and how framing can be a tool to widen public engagement is that environmental scientists need to think about how they can join with different kinds of communication partners. And in the process, they can work with those communication partners to engage a wider net of publics. So it could be, you could be working at your own local level with religious leaders, where you're giving presentations to church groups about the significance of environmental science, talking about hopefully also regional and local impacts in the process. And the religious leader is speaking to the validity of the science, and also combining it with their own interpretation of why the science is so important, because it has a certain sense of religious and moral duty to it. Working with religious leaders is generally uncommon for environmental scientists. But I think as E.O. Wilson, I think, put it best when he did an interview with Bill Moyers, he said, I'm an atheist, but if atheists sat down with religious folk and we talked about what really matters in our lives, we would agree on 95% of things. And one of the things that many religious leaders and environmental scientists agree on is the problem of climate change, and the value to human well-being and to future generations and the most vulnerable of engaging the public on the science and what might be some options or how they can get involved. The same thing with public health officials. Partnerships between environmental scientists, environmental science organizations, and public health officials. One of the problems with the public health interpretation is it's vastly undercommunicated despite the science in the area. We have almost no news attention to the public health implications. I know this from analysis that I'm working on. And even public health officials themselves at the local or state level say they're not aware of the emerging science in the area, and they're doing nothing in terms of either public education or efforts at adaptation, for example. So I think that nexus point between environmental scientists and other communication partners, I think, is really important. And I want to emphasize that. So.
Okay. My point is that you're communicating results, and all rights credit with my communicative process.
I'm dying to respond.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Just step up.
I'm sorry. It really depends on your audience. If you can talk a reporter into writing a feature story about scientific method, you go. You do that. Or if you offer your church or community or, Boy Scout leaders or some kind of community organization, a workshop on scientific communications, you knock yourself out. But if you're talking to the media, they don't have time for that. They don't care. They want to get your results out. So while I understand your desire to talk about what is really important to you, you have to, if you really want to engage people, put aside your personal interests. you have to just forget that for the moment, because people are going to remember one or two things and they're not going to listen. So judge what you're going to do by the audiences you're speaking to.
I would just add real quick, and I forgot to address your question about process, and I would agree with that statement that was just made. I mean, before learning can happen, I don't know if you teach, you have to motivate and you have to have attention. And one way to do that, as E.O. Wilson does in his book, The Creation, is to think about what is the frame of reference that makes this complexity about the process of science interesting, personally relevant, and significant to a wider audience or to a specific audience. And that's where these other dimensions of the issue that are vastly, historically undercommunicated, that's where it comes in. And once you create motivation and attention, that's when more complex learning can start to happen. And often you can't do it through the media either. You have to get beyond the media, and that's where public forums come in. And that's where kind of innovations in, say, college-level teaching and high school teaching, short-term fixes that we can do, we can introduce right away without revamping the entire curriculum like the module I suggested. But we'll have one more comment, then we have to go to Gwendolyn. Yeah.
No, do you feel like at this point the issue has been politicized enough that it's actually risky for people who are not already participating and obviously taken aside to get into it, like public health officials who are relatively neutral but respected authorities? If they come in on the side of climate change being a serious issue, do they risk being put into that box? Like I know Richard Cizik had to resign from his position with the Evangelical Congress after his NPR interviews.
Well, I think for public health officials, it will be a necessity. It already is a necessity that they have to communicate about climate change. And I think the other thing about talking about the public health impacts is that you start to open the door to a serious discussion about adaptation efforts, which until recently has been completely overlooked in news coverage and a lot of policy discussion. And you also start to localize the issue, because you're talking about local level adaptation to specific health impacts in that area or that are specific to that city or that region. But we have to go to Gwendolyn and make sure that you guys might be the first questions during the general Q&A.
Well, but perhaps I could just
Yeah.
put out, because Max Boykoff referred to the issue in communicating uncertainty and the danger in misrepresenting the extent of our knowledge. And when you come to public health impacts, the research is kind of brand new. There has been a new study that was widely reported in the press within the last few weeks on public health impacts. That's really the first major one. People who've gone out on a limb and suggested there may be public health impacts in the past have been closely scrutinized by the scientific community in terms of how far you can go given the size of the error bars. So perhaps in the ongoing conversation for the rest of the afternoon, we could be talking about communicating uncertainty in this world where people want to know, well, is it going to affect asthma or isn't it?
Right. Well, I would, I completely agree with you, and you have to work to develop the messages in a way that are consistent with the uncertainty, but also accessible, understandable, and engaging. And that takes the type of evaluation that we were doing with the public health essay, for example. And excuse me. Each one of those statements was taken from the WHO report or the peer-reviewed literature or the human health impacts of the IPCC. But this is a good segue to step over to Gwen now.